welcome everyone. This is the second panel and second day of the Symposium, Interdependency as a Condition, which is curated by Talk, Anna Bitkina, my colleague, and me, Maria Veits, as a part of fourth Arctic Art Forum, organized by our colleagues Ekaterina Sharova and Kristina Dragina, I'm sorry. And during the panel 2, we'll talk about challenging geographical, political, and mental borders, and about shared future and shared political and environmental forecast. And maybe we'll kind of challenge or dispute or kind of recode certain borders and barriers that exist on political, economic, artistic, political level. We have 3 speakers in this panel: Sergey Medvedev, Taru Elfving, Aslak, Aamot, Kjærulff, and Discussant Inga Lace. I'm sorry. And I would like to start with introducing Sergey Medvedev, who's opening the panel. Sergey is a political scientist, writer, and journalist, and he studied at Moscow University, Charles University in Prague, and Columbia University in New York. He holds PhD in history, and for the past 25 years, he's been teaching in Russia, Germany, Italy, and Finland. Arctic has always, I think, been kind of a point of his interest, and he publishes quite widely. One of his recent publications is the book The Return of the Russian Leviathan, that was published by Polity Press Cambridge, and it came out in 2020. Congrats on the book. So Sergey, the floor is yours. Sergey will be speaking in Russian. So for those who would like to hear his presentation in Russian in Zoom, I suggest you choose Russian as your main language. And this button is in right bottom corner of your screen.
Okay, well, I'd rather stay in this format because I'll see the next slide. So I think I have like big pictures, so probably we can stay in this format if you don't mind. Anyway, so I just wanted to share one intuition which always bothered me as I studied the Arctic, the semiotics of the Arctic, and this is the non-practical nature of colonization of the Arctic, as I call it, colonizing emptiness. Because now looking back at the centuries of Russian exploration and colonization of this part of the world, I think it is like a little bit like colonizing the moon. There's lots of heroism, lots of symbolism in this, but there is not much practical value. So indeed, Arctic is a part of the Russian identity and part of the national narrative. As you see in this picture, this is the rescue of Cheluzkin icebreaker ship, the Cheluzkin ship, which was stranded in the ice for months. But generally speaking, the Arctic came up on the Russian map as early as the 15th century, actually early 16th, as Muscovy, the emergent Muscovy, started spreading to the north and to the east. And colonization of the Arctic has been going in parallel with the discovery of the world by the Western civilization. Right, the West was expanding, looking for Indias, and then eventually America. So the West was going west, Russia was going east. So they were like 2 wings of the modern civilization, 2 different expansions. But note the significant difference, because the West, while expanding and colonizing and exploring, got access to immense wealth of the New World. the gold of the Incas and the Aztecs, the cotton of the new plantations, the great resources, eventually the slave labor of Africa, which was then transported to America in order to produce more wealth in this Atlantic triangle. Whereas Russia's expansion into Siberia and eventually into the Arctic was of a purely territorial format. Well, yes, I mean, Russia was getting its currency of the day for several centuries before, so to say, lost its significance later to be superseded by the Russia's prime exports such as grain. And then in the 20th century, this is the hydrocarbons. But I mean, this is more about Siberia. But as we talk about the Arctic, about this barren expanse, I once again would insist that Russia's colonization and Russia's expansion was of a semiotic rather than practical nature. And indeed, actually, much was going into this development, into this expansion, especially in the 20th century, because the Soviet Union, being a quintessential modernist project, was premised on the idea of total territorial control. The Soviet Union had to be in control of the population, in control of the territory, in control of people's minds, people's health. So it was really one of the pinnacles, one of the high points of the Enlightenment civilization, seeking to build a model utopian state. So possessing the Arctic and exploring the Arctic was pretty much part of the Soviet myth. Especially if we look at the fiction, science fiction from the 20s and the 30s. So many Soviet youngsters, pioneers, Komsomol people were really enchanted by the books of Ivan Belyaev and Veniamin Kaverin, the two captains, the explorations by the Soviet air pilots overflying the North Pole, and then eventually of Polarniki, the polar explorers, which were there stranded in the ice for months and years. Sorry? No, there was some overvoice. Anyway, the Soviet Union was really into expanding into this huge territory. And then as it, the big wave of repression started in the second half of the 1930s, the Gulag was the prime instrument in exploring and actually extracting resources from the Arctic. So there were innumerable tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were sent there into the labor camp, who remained there frozen into the permafrost. So their dead body are preserved until today. As you travel along Arctic routes, as you discover the abandoned camps, as you just see this immense Gulag archipelago, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn once called it. Now, as Stalin died and as the repression had toned down a bit, as the Gulag system in the north was dismantled, this was replaced by the culture of, let's say, romantic exploration of the Arctic. And hordes of the Komsomol construction sites, and then the tourist culture. In the 60s and the 70s, many young people traveled to the Arctic driven by the myth of geologists being like this kind of Jack London-esque type of discovering this cold and frozen and barren frontier. And then as we drive towards the end of the Soviet Union, this exploring the Arctic had basically ended. The state no longer had the strategic priorities of manning, populating, and keeping people in the Arctic. So the Arctic, after the first wave of exploration by the Gulag convicts and the second wave of development by the Komsomol construction sites and this heroic geologists and meteorologists, finally found itself stranded in the post-Soviet devastation and the post-Soviet abandon. So here is a typical picture of the Chukotka coastline, which I had taken years ago in this picture. And like the entire coast is really in bad need of a cleanup with hundreds of thousands, of probably millions of empty oil barrels dotting the coast and the tundra, and abandoned radioactive beamers, radioactive lighthouses, which are standing along the Arctic coastline, abandoned cities, the entire rivers, which are poisoned by oil, and the entire Soviet and post-Soviet exploration of the Arctic has been one of really absolutely reckless devastation, colonization without due regard to the environmental circumstances. So in the end, I would say that the Arctic has become a failed project for the Soviet Union and for Russia. Some years ago, American political scientists and geographers Fiona Hill and Cliff Gaddy wrote their famous book, The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold. And what they did was an interesting experiment. They measured the average mean temperature of January per 1,000 of population in countries so similar as Canada and Russia, lying in the same altitude, right? Lying in the same climatic zone. And it turned out that in the course of the 20th century, the average temperature of Canada has risen by something like 3 degrees. And the average temperature of Russia has fallen by the same 3-4 degrees. And the answer is why? It has nothing to do with global warming or cooling. It has everything to do with the policies of the communist planners. The Soviet Union for decades have been moving millions of people to the north for ideological reasons, for strategic reasons, having the military bases there, having this air bases that would provide for Lend-Lease deliveries from America with the aircraft flying from Alaska, and then later placing the Soviet nuclear missiles there that would have the shortest flying time to the United States over the North Pole. And then eventually just fulfilling the crazy utopian dreams of the communist planners that wanted, to turn Siberian rivers, that wanted to plant gardens in the Arctic, to change the climate, and so on. So for decades, for most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union had been moving people into the cold, into nowhere. And then as this ideological motivation had ended, all these people found themselves trapped in this settings, like you see here, a picture from Norilsk, for instance, the abandoned mining town, or many other cities in the north, which I have seen so many. Actually, all of them are not sustainable. They only can be sustained with huge subsidies, subventions from the state. And lacking those, you have tens of thousands of population that is stranded there and that is stuck there in very unfortunate social circumstances, not having the resources to relocate to the south, not having the money to buy any new housing in the south, or even their health wouldn't allow them to change climate so abruptly, moving from Magadan to Sochi, for instance. So in the end, I would say that the Arctic, looking back at these 400 years of Russia's modern exploration, and especially looking back at the last century of Soviet development, we can say that this was largely once again, a semiotic project, a symbolic project for the state that only proves its greatness, its territorial ambition to the world, but doesn't do much to build life there, to develop these lands, to build roads, to install infrastructure, to provide for the benefit and well-being of the population there, to look after the indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So there has been a colonial history with a very sad ending and no clear exit strategy. Now, what's happening now a little bit on this geopolitics, I would say that today's Russian politics about the Arctic is also purely semiotic. Russia just invests heavily in symbols, in political symbolism in the Arctic. Just to give you a few examples, one is the Russian territorial claim, which Russia is claiming almost 2 million square kilometers of the Arctic equatorium of the end of the sea bed. Because there is a claim that the Arctic shelf starts in Russia, so to say. It runs from the Russian coast, and therefore the claim for the shelf should be Russian. And actually, it's been going on for 20 years. That Russia's claim in the United Nations and the United Nations Commission for the Sea Law. And of course, it is contested because all other Arctic players, including Denmark with Greenland, including Norway, Canada, as of today, also China, everyone has a certain Arctic claim. So I think it's more or less a stalemate. But still, Russia insists that Arctica nasha, Arctic is ours, and does everything to do it. Actually, let me show some slides which prove this. Like, for instance, in 2007, the Russian submersible vehicle, Batyskaf, what it's called, was planting a Russian titanium flag on the seabed of near the North Pole, saying that, you know, the seabed there has a Russian flag there, that it's Russian as well. 2013, ahead of the Sochi Olympics, there was, as you remember, probably remember, the huge relay, Olympic torch relay. In itself, a very funny ceremony when, you know, adult people are running all around the country with the Olympic flame coming from Athens. And in Russia's case, they took actually it was different destinations. Actually, the Olympic flame was taken to space, to the International Space Station, in a special lantern. So it was, let's say, saying that space is Russian. And then it was taken to the North Pole to display that North Pole is Russian as well. And here you see the expedition, and people came in the atomic-powered icebreaker. You see with the Olympic flag here. So they came to the North Pole to have an Olympic torch ceremony at the North Pole. Although, like, administratively, politically, juridically, North Pole is not Russian territory. It's nobody's territory. But, you know, the Olympic flame was there. And one other famous episode was in 2013 when Greenpeace activists on their boat called Rainbow Warrior approached the Russian oil drilling platform, which was going to start the oil exploration and development there, with huge environmental concerns and the risks of spillage. As they approached, they were attacked by Russian Special Operation Forces, the FSB troops, which landed on their boat, which arrested them, which took them into custody, and the Greenpeace activists spent 3 months between September and December 2013 in custody in the prison in Murmansk before finally pardoned, amnestied, and released. But they were actually tried almost for cases of terrorism. And this is simply for approaching a Russian oil platform. So I think this is a very indicative case saying how sensitive Russia is about its sovereignty and its suggested, so to say, supposed territory in the Arctic. So Arctic is really on the minds of the political elite, of Putin personally. They are really as much enchanted by the Arctic myth as the Soviet youngsters from the 1920s and the 1930s, which were reading this Two Captains and other fiction. And they want to have military bases there. They want to have an Arctic transit there. They envisage a huge, military exercises in the Arctic. So this is all really, I would say, these are really grand plans, but they have very little practical value. like one about Arctic oil, having the Arctic as Russia's resource base. I mean, now these days, as the oil price stands at $40-something, it's impossible. The Arctic oil is just too expensive. It's only just pumping oil there, not for the sake of making money, just for the sake of symbols, saying that, okay, Russia makes Arctic oil. But in fact, Russia has neither the technology, because oil platforms all have to be taken from Norway. Russia doesn't have the technology itself. It can only do some underwater part, but the platform itself only can be exported and imported, and in the condition of sanctions, Russia cannot get them. Russia does not have the resources. Russia does not have the incentive, the motivation. So indeed, Arctic oil, Russia's Arctic oil, is indeed a myth. It can only be profitable at least when the oil price goes over $200 a barrel, which I think is not like now in 2020, it's not a foreseeable option. So here's one myth about Russian oil. Another myth is about the Northern Sea route, so which supposedly can be something like 4,000 miles shorter than the traditional route from East Asia to Rotterdam to Europe via the Suez Canal. But the fact is that, once again, Russia cannot provide for Arctic navigation. I mean, these seas, for all intents and purposes, are innavigable, right? The only navigation that happens there, you need the huge atomic-powered icebreakers, which can convoy 2 or 3 ships, 2 or 3 marine vessels, and 100 miles later already the ice closes as they pass. So, and even if there is like a global warming on a major scale in the next 20, 30, 50 years, even then, the floating ice, the iceberg, the land of the chartered, of sea charters there, the land of port infrastructure, there are no ports, there are no lighthouses, there's no possible navigation. So once again, that's another big myth. While the world is building more effective canals, there's a second Suez Canal, there's a Panama Canal, the second Panama Canal, there's the Nicaragua, they're building a canal there. So the global marine navigation is becoming more and more effective, whereas Russia doesn't invest anything into providing this northeast passage through the Arctic. So this is yet another myth. And the third myth, of course, is the military base that Russia is building. This new bases, they're going to fight terrorism. I'm serious. They're like strategies for fighting terrorism in the Arctic. It's really, I have a hard time imagining how this can happen. What kind of terrorist attacks can you envisage there somewhere in the Kara Sea, on the Novaya Zemlya, Wrangel Island, what, against the white bears or what? Anyway, huge resources go into there. There's special Arctic troops being developed, but this all has to do with, once again, with symbolic politics. The big boys like to play, toys, military toys, and Arctic is one big military toy that really amuses people in the Kremlin, but it has no reality to the actual security threats which Russia faces, because all of them are in the south and in the east. Russia's security threats on the border with Islam, on the border with China, and so on. So that's where Russia, on which Russia's future hinges, and that's where Russia needs a security alliance with the West in some foreseeable future in order to fend these off. So just to give you in a nutshell, these are the 3 myths about today's Russian geopolitics and the Arctic, which is territorial claim, which is oil, which is navigation, and which is like military confrontation. And all of them are void. All of them are empty. So I would say that in the 21st century, Russia continues its symbolic policy in the Arctic, not doing anything to build the structures of everyday life, to help out the people out there, to provide for new transport infrastructure, building roads, modernizing airports, flying planes there. Nothing of this is happening. Arctic is just decaying for the past 20, 30 years. Everyone who has been there can prove it, but yet it is somewhere on the mind of the people in the Kremlin, and they want to play big geopolitics, saying that Russia is a major Arctic player. So I would say that the symbolic history of Arctic as the blank space, it continues. And but Russian politics is as such pretty much about semiotics, right? Actually, we're the place which has invented the Potemkin village. So the Russia's Arctic policy is pretty much the same Potemkin village for which our country is well known. Okay, I think I've exhausted my time limit, so I'll be happy to discuss these issues later on. Thank you.
Yeah, Sergey, thank you so much. And there is lots of to dig into and to think about. And we will save all questions for the end of the panel. And now we're moving to our next speaker, Taru Elfving. And I would like to introduce her. Taru is a long-term colleague and a friend from Helsinki. She's a curator, researcher, and writer. And her practice focuses on site-sensitive investigations and the intersection of ecological and feminist thought. In previous years, Taru was working as a head of programming in two main art institutions in Helsinki. It's HIAP, Helsinki International Art Program. She worked over there for 2 years, and for 5 years she worked for an organization called Frey. So now she's a director of contemporary art Archipelaga. And it's an institution which is based in Archipelaga, which is in the area of Iceland of Sali in Finland. And so she moving her practice from the central part of Helsinki very much into the periphery, which is very much intentional because she wants to work on issues that very much connected to rethinking the idea of agency of art, and she's collaborating within her work with Archipelago Research Institute. So that's another shift from art to collaboration with academic discipline. And she holds her PhD from visual art of Goldsmiths and University of London. PhD in visual arts, visual culture from Goldsmiths of University of London. So the title of her speech is Spectral Shorelines. And Taru, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is going to be very interesting to follow Sergey's very interesting presentation, because I think I'll definitely go into much more, maybe you could say micro-politics, or the kind of also maybe proposing a different understanding of potential understanding of geopolitics that I'd be very interested to discuss afterwards. I'll try do my best to share my images now. Let's see how it goes. And here we are. Let's see. So can you all see my images, except they didn't start from the beginning? What is happening there? Let's try again. Yes, is that okay? Yeah, and so I'm going to be speaking very much from a specific island. I worked across different archipelago areas and different contexts before. For the last just over 10 years, I've been working with ecological questions with artists, often collaborating across disciplines with different sciences and also local knowledges. But at the moment, I'm very much focused on looking at the kind of planetary questions, but from a very, very specific site, and kind of taking an island as a kind of microcosm where to start from, in order to be able to navigate between these different scales, and where not just addressing the ecological issues from the kind of macro level, but also really wanting to bring the macro and the micro together. So I'll introduce first this island to you, the island of Sali, or in Swedish Säle. and why I'm interested in that, and why I believe that it allows for different kinds of prisms to understand our ecological crisis at the moment. So the island has been sort of a host to institutions for 400 years. There was first a hospital was established there, the first state-run hospital in what is today called Finland. It was from Finland was part of Sweden at the time, the 17th century, and they established a leprosy asylum on the island. So people with leprosy from the coastal areas of Finland that were part of Sweden were basically sent to this island. Slowly, gradually, the institution became a mental institution, asylum. So a hospital for mentally ill, and eventually it only hosted for the last just under 100 years. It only hosted women, so female mental patients. And what the kind of institution has become now, so the very same building that was the mental hospital was closed in the 1960s, and it became a field station, a research field station for Turku University. So since the 60s, mid-60s, they've been studying the marine environment and the ecological changes that are happening in this particular environment. Another layer to this complex history is nature conservation. So the island is also is a protected part of the nature conservation area, which means that there's also been a number of decades of different kinds of nature conservation happening on the island. So we can already see also layers of different approaches to and different understandings of conservation on the island. And the very latest sort of sediment on all of these institutional or sort of cultural histories is the tourism. So the university has now rented most of the buildings to a hotel and restaurant business. And so there is a kind of growing tourism happening on the island. So there's a kind of, you can follow from the kind of the earliest, the first state care or states, of course you can say there's not just care, but also control institution as a hospital. That was actually very much at the time with the 17th century with leprosy, the treatment was basically the word of God. You know, there was a priest was basically the doctor, there was no other care. To the point where actually the science is giving way to tourism on the island and on the kind of activities on the island. What we have there is the sort of complex colonial history is very present. So first there was the hospital established by the Swedish king. There's been one political prison on the island in the Swedish times. Then for 100 years, as Finland was part of Russia, there was another layer of kind of Russian history. A lot of the buildings now are also from that period. But there's also a history of state institutions, and you could say of the welfare state. So the kind of earlier public hospital as a kind of sort of an origin of different kinds of welfare state institutions in Finland. So we have this kind of institutions that tell when you go to the island and you start looking at environmental issues, you have this sort of prism of different kinds of institutions of knowledge, of research, of care, but also of othering, of gender, biopolitics, a very much kind of power of kind of normativity of what has been actually accepted within the society. If anybody's interested in looking at more into these histories, there's a recent, this year, this documentary film called Kjærulff, Island of Souls, made by Lotta Petronella, has just come out. And it really gives a kind of complex view on these sort of different histories. Also, the kind of interesting, the name can be translated, it's a Swedish name, Kjærulff, can be translated as Island of Souls or Island of Seals. So we have the slippage already there of souls and seals. And so I've been working with Lotta actually on establishing sort of a research platform for artists to work with scientists on the island, because of my interest in how do we look at ecological concerns today not just as ecological environmental issues, but really integrally entwining them in with other kind of cultural, social, historical, and also mental, psychological kind of levels of change happening. And this island is very much kind of allows for that kind of intersectional research into these questions. And so we've been developing this project called Spectres in Change, now with for 4 or 5 year funding with Kone Foundation in Finland, to bring artists into dialogue with the different disciplines of science on this context. But what we've also been wanting to look at closely is how do we come into this kind of place, this sort of an context to study? How does one research, you know, in this sort of a context? Here with the kind of these institutions on the island, make it very difficult to not think of these ethical questions of how do we land? What are the kind of methodologies that we bring with us? What is the impact of our research and activities? And so the kind of questions of how the power has been used through these institutions is still very much present there when we look at scientific research, when we look at how artists are researching, or to kind of quote Donna Haraway, how to inherit the different ways of living and dying that infuse every place. So how can we land here and take responsibility for the kind of impacts and those legacies that our own traditions and methodologies carry with them? How, for example, our practices and methods and technologies, are they also part of that sort of extractive sort of histories of modernity? Where are those limits of knowledge with our methodologies? And science here has been a way for us to kind of, as working in the arts, you know, the scientific methodologies have really offered a kind of a mirror for us. So rather than thinking of how science is part of this continuum of Western modernity and the research, and connected to technologies, for example, and extraction, how we and our methodologies are very much part of this same history as well. And so how do we land here? You know, what are the kind of different ways that we can actually enter this space? Who do we ask permission for enter? You know, we can't just assume access to different forms of knowledge, whether it's a local knowledge or whether it's a scientific knowledge, or different layers of the history. You know, how do we access that? And so we've been working closely with this Archipelago Research Institute, asking these questions of each other and ourselves, but also of the scientists. And one interesting question, for example, is how the kind of research is changing. At this particular institute, they've been studying specific things of this environment for 60 years now. So time series in the marine environment in the Baltic Sea for 60 years, which is a really considerable amount of data. There's very clear changes already happening and connections to climate change. But also what it brings up is this collective nature of knowledge production, that in arts, for us, it's quite hard to imagine working on something for all of your career, for example, collecting data that you will never be able to, in your career, you will not be able to analyze and make necessarily the breakthrough, you know, new knowledge out of. But you need generations of scientists working on actually collecting this sort of data that can really show us how our environments are changing and how we're impacting that. One interesting aspect there has been of kind of thinking about methodologies. So this is one of the first images of data collection from on the island in the 60s, where they're basically collecting with the old church vehicle. They're collecting samples where they're taking salinity, temperature, etc. on a regular basis every 2 weeks or so. This is what or who does the collecting now. So we have the kind of technologies of changing. Certain things are not changing. Some of the kind of data collection is basically it's the same, but now we have a machine taking temperature and salinity and so on. And what we have with this technological change, we've been asking the researchers, what is changing actually? You know, you get the data, but what else changes? You know, when you have a scientist who spends 40 years embedded in a particular environment, they are, of course, all the time observing, making complex observations and connecting different dots, even when they are just collecting a particular kind of data. When you have a machine, it only collects the data. It doesn't have the metadata the same way as the scientist, the human in that environment, who's living in that environment and who's kind of all the time recording different kinds of changes and able to hypothesize based on these sort of observations. And so we've been thinking about how technologies are changing our understanding of these environments when we're actually spending less and less time in field work, like scientists now are as well, less and less time on the field, less and less time observing, and actually allowing for technology to observe things for us. And you can, of course, make a lot of connections to how we work with technology at the moment, but also generally, you know, in for example, in art productions. So what to kind of, maybe I'll go back to this slide and leave us with this machine. One interesting aspect too is that with the technology now, there's the scientists can't fix the technology themselves. This is like, it's copyrighted, patented technologies that have to be sent somewhere to be fixed. So in the same way as we cannot actually, most of us don't have the knowledge on how to fix our tools today. There's a kind of a layer of kind of technological development and capitalism and so on that is there in between us. But so this takes me to the question of how do we approach this kind of environment? And I would argue that this calls for cosmopolitics in Isabel Stenger's terms. This kind of cosmopolitics, meaning that, as Stenger writes, that decisions should be made in the presence of all of those affected, not only humans. This also resonates with this pluriversal approach that has been proposed by Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Plaza, that calling for a world where many worlds fit. So how do we understand this kind of environmental changes in this kind of place where we have these complex human cultural histories, but also complex environmental changes that are taking place? What our work on the island has really brought up as well is this need to focus on hauntings, but hauntings as social phenomena and particular ways of knowing, rather than individual psychosis or pre-modern superstition, as how haunting or the ghosts are usually understood. But actually thinking about haunting and what haunts our modes of knowledge, disciplinary boundaries or practices of research and care, edges of vision and sensibility maybe, or what is there, what haunts between the lines of archival documents as the voices of the women, for example, in this mental institution, or scientific data. What is not measured, we don't know. You know, those are the changes in the environment that we just don't have data of. You know, there's very limited data. Or then the Excel sheets that are determining the value of research and other practices today. When we look at the kind of neoliberal or financialization of all of our public institutions as well today. So back to the islands. So there's Saley. You can't see the dozens of thousands of islands around it, but there is a lot of islands there. And what we've been sort of talking with the artists and scientists on the island is how do we critically situate our practices and knowledges on this particular island, but particularly an island that is constantly changing. It's literally changing shape. And I would like to kind of zoom out a little bit to kind of give you more of an understanding of what I'm talking about. So here we have the red dot is the little island there. We have the Baltic Sea around. Sorry, this is already finished, but there's basically an archipelago sea is in the Baltic Sea. Baltic Sea has been known as the most polluted sea in the world. It has the largest dead sea bottom areas in the world. Due to eutrophication, this nutrient overload that is caused by the fact that this sea is brackish water. It's like a large river estuary, and it has a huge catchment area. It actually catches the kind of rivers flowing from a massive area around the Baltic Sea, from in Northern Europe, also large areas of Russia, and the Scandinavian countries. So we have the kind of fresh water and the kind of and the nutrients that are building up now more and more on the top due to climate change, and they are actually they are connected to global kind of circulations of water. So from the Baltic Sea, they are flowing out to the North Sea and along Norwegian coast towards the Arctic. So actually the kind of nutrient-rich waters of the Baltic Sea are also feeding the coastal areas of Norway, for example. They're also taking a lot of microplastics with them. So there's already research on how microplastics are we can trace microplastics from the Baltic Sea area all the way to the Arctic. And then once they reach Arctic, they start going down to on the Western Atlantic towards tropical waters, where again we have the air currents then coming back east. So there's a direct connection with all of these waters. Very local water systems are already connected to these sort of planetary flows. Then if we zoom in, we can look at, there's two images here that show us how the Ice Age ended about 10,000 years ago and how Baltic Sea was formed. So Baltic Sea is 10,000 years old, so it's very young as a sea. And so at the moment, what's happening still is actually the land is rising in northern parts of the Baltic Sea. So the Finnish coast on the western coast and southern coast is rising about half a meter in 100 years. And so there's more and more land all the time. So this is called glacial rebound. The question of whether the waters, the global kind of sea levels will rise even faster with climate change and catch up is still there. There isn't enough modeling to be able to see if this will happen. The other bigger kind of planetary change that is actually then also having a very direct impact locally is climate change. So we have more and more rain, which lowers the salinity of the water, which again is basically affecting this brackish water dramatically. We have all the marine ecosystem has to adapt really rapidly now to less and less salt in the water. And if we go, and this is what the data from the Research Institute shows us, that the size of herring has decreased dramatically in 60 years. It's basically gone down to from about 25 centimeters to 16 centimeters, which is a dramatic change in a species of fish in this environment. And so the kind of the food chain is changing, but also the creatures living in the water, in the sea, are having to adapt their in their sort of bodily balance of salt, the salinity, to the environment around them. So they're literally having to change their bodies because of the salinity, the salt levels are changing in the environment. And so this is the kind of this is where I go to the microscopic, and the kind of scale of how, if we start trying to understand how these sorts of environments are changing, what is the kind of ecological changes that are happening, we have to understand that kind of at the global level that comes with the climate crisis, for example, and climate change, changing temperatures and rain and so on. But we also have to look through the microscope and really kind of look into very closely inside the organisms to understand where the change is also happening and how we and our bodies and our kind of metabolism is part of this change in complex ways. This is the kind of view of the Baltic Sea water with the microscope. Looking at the sample with our bare eyes, you don't see anything. It's basically like see-through, nothing. And once under a microscope, you see that it's actually a soup, extremely thick soup of different kinds of organisms that are there. So the questions of what do we actually see, where the kind of vision, how can we actually see the changes happening, and what kind of different perspectives and scales we need for that. Really quickly, just to kind of reference to some of the art projects that have been developed on the island. Kati Rover has been making a video work, listening, using sound recordings and also images from the kind of sea, looking at the kind of this question of how a salinity, for example, the salt level that on this island area is the same as human tears. So we have a very, at the moment with this salt level, our human bodies are very much in tune with this water. And also looking at questions of how oxygen, for example, is produced by half of our oxygen on the planet is produced by plankton in the oceans. And so when the environments are changing, we're actually directly, there's massive changes happening in the kind of lungs of the earth that are not just the trees, but also actually the very, very microscopic and invisible to us plankton. So this kind of embodied entanglements, how do we approach this sort of inter and intradependencies of ours, in a kind of global scale, but also in a very, very kind of close embodied scale. Another kind of example is Arja Rönnel's research on eel migration. Many species in the seas migrate. We know very little about their migration, but we know that we're blocking their migration with, for example, hydropower dams. So the eels can't, the eels are very interesting creatures because they only reproduce in the Sargasso Sea in Western Atlantic. So these guys all have to go over there and come back. These are the little glass eels, tiny little eel babies that have just come back from from the other side of the Atlantic. And they've been caught in Gloucestershire in the UK, from where they are now flown to different lakes and waterways in the Scandinavian, because they can't actually migrate naturally anymore because of the barriers that we, on the rivers. And so there's this sort of human-induced and migrations as part of the kind of care that are happening that are extremely complicated. Oh, you can see the little guys moving there a little bit. Or then plants. There's Kalle Ham and band of Veits have been studying plants on the island of Sali, and looking at how plants are migrating and how partly with humans, but also because of this, for example, this land that is constantly being kind of coming up. So the island has changed quite dramatically in 400 years. There's a lot of new shoreline, but also now with temperatures changing, they're sort of, how can plants, how can they actually migrate fast enough to keep up with the warming climate, for example? But then also kind of they're looking at cultural changes in understanding of plants. For example, these meadow gowweeds that is here, this pink flower, is extremely protected today. Island of Sali is the only place where there's an abundance of it in Finland anymore. It used to be very, very abundant, but it's because of sort of agricultural changes, it's more or less vanished. And what it used to be considered a complete weed and a pest because it would actually live on the wheat fields and destroy the taste of the wheat because it's quite bitter. And now it's extremely tightly conserved species. So these are some of these different perspectives. And what Kalle is doing there, he's recording the plants, and this kind of takes me now to the kind of towards the end of my presentation and the questions of geology again as well, and the kind of geopolitics. So Kalle is recording. They're recording the plants and the inner sound of plants that is actually caused by their connectedness with the environment. So what actually what they can capture with the sound is actually the flow of minerals in the plants. So the sound is actually not the sound of the plant itself, but actually its connection to its environment, and how these different minerals that are actually traveling and feeding the plant are also obviously part of the metabolism and of ours, and how what we need from our environment, how plants are actually giving us minerals that our bodies are, need. And so just a few points to the questions to the end, maybe that we can return to in the discussion, hopefully. So the kind of questions of different scales, temporalities and cycles. We can look at water as a community, a multi-species community, or maybe even a multi-mineral, also kind of geological community that humans are also part of. Like Maria Puig de la Bella Casa has written about soil. We could think of that also in terms of water. How are we part of that community? How do we approach this, understand this community? How can we maybe kind of develop a sort of communities of care, referring back to last night's presentation of community of change? What kind of communities of care do we need? How can we care well for these communities that we're part of? And what kind of knowledge is needed? Can we kind of think of something as caring knowledge? that is needed for this. And what does it mean to be rooted in these sort of environments that are in ceaseless change today, in a more and more rapid change? So instead of this kind of linear progressive futurity, I would also argue that we need to reckon with these histories that are haunting the present. We need also reparations, not just preparations for the future. And here we need these different, we really need to kind of be able to approach and mediate between these different scales of change that are happening, from the microscopic, for example, to the sort of planetary ocean and air currents, and to understand how they are in a sort of completely integral way interconnected. And so if we look at these sort of interdependent scales, what kind of geopolitics would this actually bring forward? You know, if we actually start moving not just on this sort of planetary scale of things or territorial understanding of geopolitics, but thinking about the sort of geological formations, those different temporalities of geology, but starting from the bones and the breath of every living being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taru. It's very inspiring conclusion as well. And thanks for sharing with us some examples of artistic work that really dig into invisible processes in ecology and planetary, and also working on the micro level, micro scale, and actually trying to look for visual language for this slow violence that is happening slowly, invisibly, anonymously. And thanks for actually sharing with us the frame or the border of the how far the art institution can go, how well it could be collaborate with different knowledge and different discipline as well.
Thank you for inviting me to respond to those amazing presentations. And they have been really inspiring, and I really have to say that I've gained a lot of new information and insights, because in a way, like, I am in no way an expert in the region of the Arctic. I come from Latvia, from Riga, and I've worked in the Baltic, Nordic regions or region, among other places. But what I felt is that I could try to somehow introduce some of the concepts, ideas, or material realities that I have used in my curatorial work that could be productive to this discussion. And so, but first, yeah, like, I would really think that, like, to just kind of make a general conclusion, and also something that Masha already addressed, is really this question of scale that the speakers address, and it's really varying, right? Like that it's somehow going from super large, like imperial colonial kind of aspirations of Russia in terms of the Arctic, and then it goes to the micro, to really this microorganisms and small scale, and really like nanotechnologies that appear in the presentations of Taru and Aslak. And I think what is crucial, and how we, I guess, as artists and cultural practitioners participate in this discussion, is always by rendering those things visible. So like rendering visible both the too large scale and the too small scale, in which in many ways like politics and geopolitics works, but also like where biology and science works. And those things have somehow often became too hard to encompass because of their varying scale, I feel. And then through different, like projects and discussions and artistic, ways, actually, I think this is this very important somehow role that we can do. But some things that I wanted to share also, that already I thought about before, just when still reading your abstracts, was that I wanted to evoke the concept of shared history, which I think is important when you speak about any kind of region, or maybe any sort of different places in the world, or it can be productive and useful. So for instance, I worked when I worked in the museum collections in Latvia, exposing how those collections or art objects can connect, you know, with other places through this notion of shared histories. And then if you evoke this shared history, you can actually work towards a more inclusive society today and for the future, acknowledging the plurality of stories existing in parallel. And basically shared history means that two different entities share a certain, you know, part of history with each other. This may involve like local, regional, or national areas that have like a partly shared history with other local, regional, or national areas. And it can be used to look at the areas of conflict or at colonial relationships. And here within this discussion, I thought that it becomes important to admit that the shared pasts or shared histories is like an entanglement of so many entities, both human and non-human alike. And I think, and then how do we manage to listen to those multiple sides, multiple voices, and multiple stories and histories from so many different points of view? And if we manage to tell them, and not only us, like, you know, we allow all those entities to speak, and then how do we also listen? So, and then how those stories are not only told from the dominant, like nation states, but also from the subaltern, from the colonized, from the marginalized, from indigenous people. Somehow, how do we evoke, you know, also voice of the nature, for instance, and maybe we can use microhistories or you know, different methods, I guess. And so when this multitude of different voices is, you know, I think listened to, and then we can speak about certain kind of like shared future. Then I also thought about another thing, which kind of relates to this screening series, like Ecologies and Infrastructure, which I recently worked on in relation to the post-Soviet region. And this is the question of infrastructures or infrastructure. And to me, it seems that so environment and ecology is always in negotiation with economic and political interests and with power. And some of the most visible, but also often the most invisible manifestations in dialogue or maybe in competition with ecological interests are the infrastructures of energy and transport, and of course, most recently, the data, with the data storing, electricity and other resources, and consumption and emission. And to me, and since, you know, like working on this screening and looking maybe at the former kind of like Soviet infrastructures and thinking how they have been like overlaid by new capitalist infrastructures, it seemed interesting to actually also maybe within this region, how we could like ask this question, like what are the infrastructures linking the region together and linking it with other areas, and which are the power structures there, like historically and maybe more recently, and what is planned in the future? Because I guess those are the projects that are still involved, you know, different kind of new extractions, new power relationships, and in a way they are invisible, but they are often very like ecologically devastating, or also culturally, you know, entering the territories where seemingly like no one lives. It's like an emptiness, but actually, you know, it's inhabited by someone still, right? And then I was really fascinated by this idea of emptiness and how it relates to the colonial. And I just wanted to mention maybe this film that I was recently watching. It's called Nova Lituania, and it's about like the 30s when there is, and it's based on the real story of a Lithuanian geographer, who says like, oh, you know, the war is approaching and it's not safe anymore for Lithuanians to be in our country, and how the you know, how the world works is that the place which is more empty gets colonized by a more like populous place. So obviously, like our neighbors, they have a bigger density, so they will like, you know, colonize us or occupy us. So we should go to another place which is more empty and like make a new Lithuania there. So there was again this like colonial aspiration there, and of course the project like never happened, but it seemed interesting how, yeah, like how whenever like colonization is involved, the idea of emptiness is evoked. And I'm sometimes thinking, like, yeah, that places can be empty from the human perspective, right? But like what happens from the perspective of ecosystems or nature, that's kind of also very, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, I think there are like a lot of other threads, but maybe I could finish with this one idea that I've had tried to also evoke, and I think it's always important when we do those gatherings. Like when I was doing the project instituting ecologies at the Apple Art Center in Amsterdam, and also trying to involve artists and curators involved in ecological thinking. So I was wondering how can actually contemporary art and its practitioners like contribute and be heard in those current debates concerning the, you know, growth-oriented economy and the impact of the natural and its impact towards the natural world, the social inequality and climate change, and how can ecological awareness be practiced through contemporary art and different interdisciplinary projects, and how can actually human-made institutions be reimagined to include the rights of nature within their modus operandi. And for instance, I think I saw something really interesting in projects of Aslak, which are like really very, very interdisciplinary, and perhaps there you can find certain answers where you kind of, instead of enclosing, you're more like opening up to other practitioners and other disciplines, and to make your voice heard. Perhaps it's like really important, and I mean also in project of Taru, I guess it's important to collaborate and to kind of let those voices, to have this dialogue and let the voices be heard. And I think maybe I could also somehow well, maybe another thing which I would like to address is this. Again, it's very interesting that you're choosing a region, like to focus on the region instead of, I don't know, wherever, a nation state or that you're like really locating kind of yourself there, and also this region kind of like has different nation states claiming or having their feet in there. And and that maybe is an interesting moment where to think across national borders to address climate change. It could be a very interesting example, because I would like to evoke maybe like this Bruno Latour's thinking, because he has pointed out that this dynamics and psychology of the climate crisis brings forward is that there is a lot of fear that arises from this climate catastrophe, and that leads to a tendency to focus on self-protection and on enclosing yourself within the national border. So there is this kind of weird hysteria that makes you exclude all the others and enclose yourself, and that also, in his theory, kind of like provokes people to vote for the right-wing nationalist parties and like that kind of processes that happen. And and I'm thinking how to somehow realizing that still try to work across borders, because this is also like there are so many substances that are connecting like water, air, and with them together the pollution kind of is traveling, and entities like viruses and other, like they cross borders like seamlessly. And at the same time, we still, a lot of policies are working within nation states, right? And and somehow how to change that, perhaps. So is this nation state versus like opening up the borders. And that's a question, of course, how to do it.
Inga, thank you so much for your comment. And I think, like, to continue your thought, I would say that one of the main idea for this panel was to expand some channels for exchange of knowledge and information and experiences and expertise as well, and actually look at some already existing formats of different infrastructure as also different organizational structures, and maybe also somehow work towards some sort of ecological and political imaginary. And I think Arctic is also interesting region to some sort of contemplate and experiment to think about this new and very important planetary territory of how to maybe to thinking about geography otherwise. And I think maybe Sergey Medvedev could give us a little bit like further futuristic ideas about what he thinks about how maybe this understanding of ruling the Arctic could be understood otherwise, maybe from this from the perspective of different understanding of geopolitical borders and political policy in general.
Yeah, is there like any alternative to this colonial approach? Because also, as we've seen in the presentations, you know, when Russia sharing borders with other countries and representatives of the countries that are in the panel, how can this, you know, super long policy of colonialism when it comes to Arctic be maybe altered and changed to something else? That was also my thinking and question to Sergey.
Okay, I think there were some useful inroads suggested in comments by Inga. And I think it has to do with regionality and the cross-borderness, because Arctic by definition is a very cross-border thing. It's a very regional thing. That's where regionalism comes at its foremost. I've been doing regional studies like all over the world, and Arctic is the place which is by its nature of environmental threats, of people's movements, like, you know, take the Sami people, which are situated across the borders of several nations, and they have the transnational parliament. So like the global warming patterns, the ice drifting patterns, the migration of animals, and so on. So whichever way you look at it, there's cross-borderness, there's a regionality which calls for a different political agenda. And this agenda obviously needs to be non-national, which is against the grain of the present-day politics, because what's happening in the 21st century is the renationalization of politics and the renationalization of the Arctic. And that's what I sadly see. That is what I sadly see in the Russian approach, like claiming the national stake, bringing the national flag, delineating the national border. And well, Russia is not the only one, as I mentioned. China is a big playing a big game there, and the other Arctic nations are doing this as well. So ideally, of course, Arctic should be a international, non-national, how I say, territory, much like the model of the Antarctica. Like if we look at the South Pole, if we look at the other end of the globe, we look at the Antarctic, there was a treaty, if I'm not mistaken, in 1957, which announced it in international territory, free of military activity, free of economic activity, and only open for scientific exploration. And that's it. Right? It doesn't belong to everyone, to any nation. It only belongs to humanity. Certain nations can have their scientific stations there, but definitely there are no military bases. There's no oil exploration. There is no natural resource exploration, and so on. So it's a territory which is vital for humanity's climate, and therefore it belongs to humanity. So ideally, this should be, of course, applied in the Arctic. But the problem is that much of the human history of the past millennium, indeed several millennia, has been going on around the northern hemisphere. And Arctic emerged as a very contested territory. And humanity could easily agree on the Antarctica because there's no, it's just too far. It's just too far from North Atlantic. It's just too far from where main decisions about the global civilization are taking place. And therefore, against the background of like some détente in the late 1950s, humanity could agree about leaving Antarctica alone. But of course, people would not so easily agree about the Arctic. And yet the time is running out. The Arctic is warming, the ice is melting, the animals are trapped in there, have nowhere to go. The local communities are degrading, at least in Russia. And I think we'll be presented with these choices sooner or later. There is a call by Greenpeace to announce the Arctic and international territory free from war and economics. Let's put it this way. But yeah, once again, I fully understand this is a utopian call, but if we're talking about the long the long duration, if we're talking about the entire 21st century and the prospects of global warming, I think humanity will have no other way than to agree about the Arctic in this way. And I mean, talking of colonialism, I think people should be thinking along these ways about other territories, like the moon, for instance, because we now are seeing the start of the race for the moon. With, you know, there is a pool of nations now going there. They're going to have the excavations there. They're going to have to, you know, dig for resources there, extracting helium, making this as a jump base for the further space exploration, and so on. So I think before it's too late, humanity should make an agreement on, I would say, refraining the exploration of the moon. Only for the scientific purposes. No military, no economy, no resource exploration of the moon. I would put it this way. Once again, it's very hard to imagine in the age of national egoism and you know, the likes of Trump and Putin and you know, many of other and Erdogan and many other egoistic leaders ruling the world. Yeah, so if we're here gathered to think about the unthinkable and imagine the unimaginable, that's definitely a point to consider. Okay, so that's my take, and I apologize if I just left somewhat a bit early because I think we're like half an hour past the deadline. 7 years ago, I raised the issue. So suddenly on a national level, I made a comment on Facebook and this was taken to Putin's attention. And there was a big national debate, and still until now, they're trying to start a criminal investigation against me for simply proposing the idea of sort of challenging, questioning the sovereignty, national sovereignty in the Arctic and making this an international zone. So sensitive this issue is, at least for Russia. But look, ideally, there are organizations like the United Nations. There's an international, you know, convention on the sea, there are international campaigns in place, be it from Greenpeace or from other organizations. So I would say international campaigning and decision making at a international level. First of all, the United Nations. I may also think about the G7, G8, or the G20. That, you know, bringing this to the attention of the world leaders at the highest level. So only by working on, you know, this PR level, the pressure from the global civil society can bring this forward. But once again, as I mentioned, there are no enforcement mechanisms. There's no world government. There's no world army. There's no world tax authority. We're still living in the world of nation states in the first third of the 21st century.
But I think in this respect is also there is a competition for the possibility to invest into science, meaning invest into collecting data, which is also like becoming the biggest capital between all these five nations, and others like China, Japan. They're also trying to collect information about like resources and collect data, placing their stations in Arctic. I think there is a competition also for that kind of capital is happening, because I think not all 5 countries can invest equally into scientific research, and maybe that's one of the reasons when they it's like neither financial nor national borders is possible to overcome. So, but I just yeah, sorry, Taru.
I would just add that also, yeah, there's definitely a kind of race with science also to the Arctic, but also with arts. I would remember that artists and arts organizations are very much part of these same processes as well. There's a lot of investment in particular kinds of areas in the world, and with arts, whether it's residence, other art programs, and the kind of often with very good intentions and very critical intentions, but it's also really crucial to understand how we're all kind of entangled in this same, and possibly also kind of impacting things in a particular way. So our activities are political in that sense, and politicized very easily, or kind of somehow contributing to these processes in the same way as science. And so I think kind of how we are actually entangled in those bigger political kind of maneuvers and competitions over territories is really crucial. And then how do we work against that in some ways? How do we actually, as artists and scientists, because we also have the knowledge and the different kinds of methodologies to kind of to challenge those sort of mainstream narratives, and to kind of bring up different points of view, or kind of give voice, whether it's to kind of indigenous communities or different other worldviews and different modes of knowledge, that are actually on the ground, very, very kind of situated often in particular environments. And so how do we kind of make space for that? I think it's really crucial there.
And I think you demonstrated, like you and Aslak, you demonstrated some sort of mechanism and institutional structures from different perspectives, how actually this knowledge and these changes could be put in some visual forms. And I think this such institutions like aquaporing, which Aslak is brought into his presentation from the scientific world, this kind of fundamental science and technology development institution, this format actually, I think, slowly moving towards art fields. So there is kind of information that artists are working with is maybe doesn't have like necessarily immediate material or visual format, but it's working towards this development of public knowledge, and it's giving us understanding about the complexity of reality from both sides. And I really want to believe that we sort of are demonstrating with our panel this definition of new communities of change, which Medina brought into our attention yesterday. And this kind of like apparatus, which we try to build within this 1.5 to 2 hours panel, could be maybe taken further and think about these channels which we try to create of knowledge exchange and information and experiences we can maybe create to take it further in our disciplines. And I think what Taru also said about that, it's thinking about the future. Yeah, there is a need for actually to work towards repairing the history instead of always try to prepare ourselves for the future. And then I think it gives us a good bridge towards our afternoon panel as well.
Because we're going to talk about the consequences of environmental traumas and catastrophes that have long been silenced.
New generation.
and you know, repressed narratives, and how arts can also deal and give voice to underrepresented communities, underrepresented stories and histories. And we're going to continue in an hour and a half, 1 hour and 26 minutes to be precise. And I hope it will all run smoothly. I hope each panel will be running more and more smoothly technically.
Yeah.
And we want to thank all of you for joining and for your input. It has been super interesting. And, you know, I think we'll also be reflecting upon it a little later when just this new information will settle down a little bit. So thank you, and we'll continue very soon, and consider joining the next panel as well. So we're having a little break, and then we're going to be back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.